Breakthrough. Breakthrough.
Breakthrough.
Breakthrough. Breakthrough. Breakthrough. Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough News.
You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
It's good to be back on with you, Eugene. And
Is it?
after a week, yes, it always is. Sorry, I
Thank
fumbled
you.
that. I can't. It's how I do the opening. Okay, it's a part of my whole shtick. No, actually, I did miss you because we didn't have a show last week.
That's true.
So I am very happy to be back on with you.
Well, hopefully our
Alongside
viewers
you.
are also happy to be back with us. We've got a great show for you here today, as we always do. Many things to talk about, from big union battles breaking out here in the United States, African debt, trips to Cuba, many more things. You know, First Republic, banks collapsing all over the place. There's a couple more today that are on the way down, drone attacks on the Kremlin. So many different pieces for us to get to from many different continents, many different issues. So this would be a great time for you to tell anyone you know to come here to YouTube, to find us, to follow us, however you want to do so. And you're already here on YouTube, so make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell, so that way you'll be subscribed to all the fantastic content that we have here at Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And you have the bell, so that way you will know when all of this new content that you have subscribed to is coming out, so you won't have to do a lot of work to follow Breakthrough News very closely. So, get your air horns out, alert your neighbors that the show is beginning, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and what else should people do, Rania?
Well, you can also support the show, support all our programming, and access exclusive content by becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a patron. And you can access Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa. You can access my entire episodes of my show Dispatches. Right now, about half of it is inaccessible to those who aren't members, and it's a really great show. That is totally worth it. And of course, for those who just want to support the show one time, you can do a donation in the YouTube chat. We always appreciate that, as well as at our website at breakthroughnews.org. But most importantly, become a patron, access exclusive content, patreon.com/breakthrough news. And for all of those who are watching right now, please do remember to hit the like button. It helps us in the algorithm. And I will shame you for not doing it. So unless you want to get finger wagged by me later in this episode, you better hit that like button.
Yeah, well, that's sometimes, I guess, a threat is the way you got to do it. But I would just appreciate if you would be, kind enough to offer to hit that like button. So, we have a good look. Indeed, you catch more. What is it? Whatever it is with honey as opposed to vinegar. Is it flies? Is it bees? I don't know. I've heard them both. But anyway, long story short, like it, donate, subscribe, hit the bell, let people know we are here on the Freedom Side Live on Breakthrough News. So we want to just jump right into it here, and we want to start off our conversation by discussing the shackles of debt that have been holding down the African continent for decades. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Grief Shelwell, who is the Director of Research at the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Grief, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Eugene and Rania, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is really all ours. And, recently you worked on a fantastic dossier, I have to say, from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research about exactly this issue of African debt. And I was hoping to start, you could maybe just sort of set the frame for us a little bit, because one of the things I thought was most interesting in the report is, whether we're talking about the rise of the IMF debt regimes in the mid-1970s or the rise of the huge explosion of private debt in the early part of this century, it seems like this is not just sort of a neutral reality that was set forward, but that the debt mechanisms are designed to institutionalize a certain global power structure. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that.
You're right, Eugene. I think debt as a mechanism of control, I think, is the way you've put it. And it's worth for your listeners and viewers to sort of understand, why is it that the African continent, in many ways, seems to be addicted to debt? It looks like it's addicted to debt. But I think it's important to understand that history has gotten us to this point, right? So the history of colonialism, the history of imperialism, the current moments of neocolonialism have gotten us into this kind of situation where many of our countries are always lacking in the sufficient capital to do what they need to do, right? So countries need to put up infrastructure. We need to invest in hospitals, schools, roads, electricity, the kind of stuff that's really important and a precondition for development. But we do not have sufficient capital internally. Why is it that we don't have sufficient capital internally? Because a lot of our capital is spirited away to the West, right? So we then find ourselves in this kind of situation where we are capital deficient, and because we're capital deficient, we then have to borrow. Not unlike the situation of like a low wage worker who is exploited and extracted, and they have no choice but to go to a payday lender, as is the case in the US, right? So this is similar to the African situation, and because of that, we go through these cycles of debt. And that debt, like you were saying, Eugene, is used as a mechanism of control. It's a mechanism of subordination and all those kinds of things.
And it's interesting, this is happening right now where you see this new sort of cycle of IMF going around the world, advising countries in the global south, whether in Latin America or the Middle East or Africa or Asia, to institute even more austerity measures in a time when a lot of countries are suffering from the aftermath of COVID, for one. I mean, COVID destroyed a lot of economies. In ways that the global south had a much more difficult time bouncing back from, if it hasn't really done that, actually. And then moreover, we have this war in Ukraine that has, led to shortages of certain items. I know, I live in Lebanon, for example, and the country's cash strapped because of its own economic crisis, on top of the fact that oil, fertilizer, prices of all of these raw commodities, shot up. And so right now, it seems as though the IMF is going around to a lot of African countries and trying to, push for more austerity. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly the IMF is demanding right now, and if it's any different than in the past?
Rania, yeah, that's a good question. And I think, again, tying up to the question Eugene asked earlier, we have to understand. So essentially, the IMF, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, when an idea that came out of the establishment of the United Nations, right? So when the United Nations was established right after Second World War, there was a thinking, and it's a bit tricky to assess whether the United Nations has been a net good or not. But I think for a while, the UN did play quite an important role. I think, for example, the movement to politically decolonize many countries in Africa, for example. That idea was given quite some credence by the UN. Anyway, so the World Bank and the IMF came out of this settlement after Second World War. And the idea itself was a good idea. The idea was essentially to say, look, we are always going to have crisis of one form or the other. And as brothers and sisters, we need to look out for each other. So we're going to establish two organizations, the World Bank to finance long-term development, and then the IMF to sort out short-term financial crises, like the one that Lebanon is going through, or the one that many countries in the global south are going through. So a great idea on paper. Now, the sad thing is that this great idea on paper became captured by the US and Western Europe, right? It became geopoliticized. These two entities became tools of projecting Western power. And that's why it's no surprise that the IMF is headquartered in Washington, D.C. The World Bank is headquartered in Washington, D.C. The president of the World Bank is effectively picked by the president of the U.S. And the managing director of the IMF is effectively picked by Europeans, right? So one has to understand this. And because of this, and because there's this, the West wants to maintain dominance, economic dominance, it's useful for capitalism, for example, to have subservient countries to provide the raw materials that powers the engines in the center, in the core, in the metropole, right? So all this, when you think about all this stuff, it then makes sense to have austerity, right? For the IMF to swoop into a country in the global south, instead of saying you're in an economic crisis moment and you ought to be spending more, particularly on the poor, particularly on the working class, particularly on marginalized communities. That's what you ought to be doing. After all, that's what often happens in the West when there's an economic crisis. You don't do austerity, you do the reverse. But again, it all makes sense why the IMF comes over here and they say, cut spending on health, education, and those kinds of things, precisely because we want to maintain you in a state of perpetual subservience. Right. So I hope this it was a roundabout way around of answering your question, but I had to do that to get to this
perfect.
point.
Yes.
No, there's so many layers to it, and obviously there's so much obfuscation of it. And I'm sure you've seen this. The Kiel Institute in Germany has just released their new database on African debt, and there's a range of things that it reveals. But one of the things I thought was interesting is they examined the rates of interest of the various types of loans, and of course the private loans were significantly higher than almost everything else coming from the bond market, and so on and so forth. And they were noting that some of the African countries have become so trapped in these debt cycles that they're taking out lower interest loans to pay off the higher interest loans. And it's just an unbelievable cycle, so that almost nothing is really being paid towards the actual needs of the country to some degree. It just now becomes, as you said, like a payday lender sort of reality. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, that aspect of how the various different types of lenders are who is out there, the IMF, there's China we hear a lot about, there's private loans, but how those things sort of interact as well.
That's true. And I think, there's a core fundamental issue, which is that a lot of countries in the global south, particularly in Africa, have are deficient in capital, in sort of funds to fund these large scale development projects. Eugene, you can't develop without sufficient electric power. You can't develop without laying out a road network, without a communications infrastructure. These things are incredibly critical. And many of these countries, again, were dealt bad set of cards from colonialism, because all that colonialism did was build infrastructure that supported the extraction of raw materials to feed the beast in the West, right? So a lot of these countries are trying to play catch up, right? And they're desperate for capital. The World Bank was supposed to be performing this role of supplying long-term capital at very low interest rates, at what they call concessional interest rates. But the World Bank, for geopolitical reasons, like I just illustrated a short while ago, tool of Western power, doesn't want to do that, because if the World Bank does its job properly, then a lot of these countries in the global south will be self-sustaining, they'll stand on their own, and then nobody can push them around. So because the World Bank hasn't been performing this role, right, a lot of loan sharks or Shylocks or whatever you want to call them have popped out of the woodworks, right? So it is not the case that the Zambian government, for example, chose to go borrow from private lenders at higher interest rates. That wasn't a choice they made. They were forced into doing that, precisely because of the reasons that I've just given. And so that's what explains this sort of different profile of lenders, right? It is a reaction or response to the fact that the multilateral institutions that are supposed to coordinate all this for us in a brotherly and sisterly way, in a peaceable way, haven't been doing it. And therefore, again, I like this analogy of payday lending. Folks don't go to payday lenders because they want to. They do it because they're shut out of the actual form of financial system. Either they have high credit scores as a result of racism, discrimination, all sorts of stuff. So I think that's important to illustrate why we have this different profile of lenders.
I also, I wanted to ask, because the argument's always made in the general consensus in the mainstream, really around the world, is that in order for these countries to do better economically and to deal with all this debt, they have to take out not only more loans, but they have to, again, institute all these austerity measures that keep them from, developing properly. And so one of the things that I think is important is to talk about there are actual alternative ways to deal with these sorts of things if these countries were allowed to, and if it wasn't up to the US and the Europeans and these financial institutions like the IMF that they control. So can you talk about some of those alternatives?
Yeah, you're right. And I think so the issue is, the fundamental issue is this deficiency of capital, right? So how are we going to get hold of this capital? How do we get this capital that we really need to power our own development? The first thing, for example, is transnational corporations or multinational, the big companies that operate across many borders, most of whom are headquartered. I can't even think of any exception, but many of them are headquartered in the West, make it incredibly difficult to be able to collect tax revenues. I mean, they just make it incredibly difficult, right? So what some countries in the global south are trying to do is to get together and figure out, is there a way we can work together to make sure that we can begin to tax these multinationals that extract lots of profit from our countries, and then they put it away in tax havens, right? You know, in sort of in tax havens. Is there now, to be able to do that, you got to work together. So like there's some experiments in Latin America. Some Latin American countries are trying to get together, for example, to try and work together and find a mechanism of collecting some of this tax revenue, which will go a long way in closing this capital deficiency gap that I just spoke about. Another mechanism which countries are trying to experiment with in the global south, particularly Latin America. Latin America is a very interesting place because they're very imaginative. They're very imaginative in trying to think about alternatives. So can we find a way of bypassing the US dollar? Because again, that's a problem. A lot of our debt is dollar denominated debt, which puts us at the mercy of the US Federal Reserve Bank, right? But can we find a mechanism of doing some of these transactions by bypassing the dollar? So can we establish regional currency arrangements? For example, I think the new president of Brazil, the old but then again new president, he was there before, he's come back again, has proposed this idea of the SUR. I think it's SUR, right? A regional currency that can facilitate trade and finance, right? So those are some of the many and other types of examples. Can we come up with alternative development banks, new types of development bank that can perform the role that the World Bank was meant to perform, but that they've neglected to do? I think you might have heard of the new development bank, aka BRICS Bank, that's headquartered in Shanghai, China, the president of BRICS Bank is Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil. And the new development bank has a simple mandate. They want to do development financing in a brotherly and sisterly way with very low interest rates for a very long maturity, a very long term, and to finance infrastructure development in a way that facilitates development and doesn't trap these countries in cycles of debt. So Rania, those are some of the alternatives. And I think there are many that have been floating around, and these things are not new. These things are not new. Many of those who've come before us have proposed them, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many types of alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wonder how you also evaluate this issue of, you know, the role China is playing. I mean, obviously in the G20 common framework debt mechanism, this has become the most controversial issue, with the West essentially saying that they are refusing to address anything regarding Zambia's debt, Ethiopia's debt. I guess, you know, Chad, it's a little bit different, but whatever. They're essentially saying that they want China to be the first mover, with the implication being that China is the biggest problem, and thus, you know, the whole debt trap narrative. So I wonder how you evaluate that.
Thanks for bringing that up, Eugene. And I mean, obviously, the truth is much more complex. And again, it's a game of geopolitical posturing that's going on, right? So China is a rising power. Some people, the old powers are not very happy with this. There's a new kid on the block. So the new kid on the block is getting all the flack. That's essentially what's going on here. I mean, certainly China is not being insincere, because China is asking a couple of questions. For example, one of the most interesting things about how we think about sovereign debt, Eugene and Rania, is that multilateral development banks like the World Bank, for example, are required not to take a haircut. So they have also lent money, and they are saying, we want to get paid 100 cents on the dollar. We want to get paid 100 cents on the dollar. We're not going to take a haircut. In the case of Zambia, somebody else should take a haircut. And maybe China should take a haircut. And understandably, China is saying, why should I take a haircut whilst you are refusing to take a haircut, World Bank? After all, much of these problems have been created by you guys. So that's some of the dialogue and some of the deliberation, which kind of makes sense, right? Also, the hedge funds, the sort of US, Western European hedge funds, also have got a role to play in this. So they also say, we don't want to take a haircut. China should take a haircut because China caused this. But that's not really true. And I think one of the most interesting things, Eugene and Rania, is that when you do a survey on the African continent and you ask, say, the typical African and say, what's your view of China, right? And surveys have been done on this. Many people respond by saying, we're kind of favorable. And it makes sense. Why would they say this? Because they can kind of see the fruits of our interactions with China. If you come to many African capital cities, Eugene, you see that the infrastructure landscape has changed. You can see highways, you can see hospitals, you can see power stations. And then many are asking the question, oh, we've been dealing with the US for quite a while now. We've been dealing with Britain for quite a while now. But we've never really we've never seen this kind of tangible fruits of friendship, right? So I think this is what's going on here. And I think China is being blamed when the truth is much more complex. And when China has really been trying to play ball. In the era of COVID, for example, when COVID broke, China was one of the first countries, and I think one of the few countries, to suspend interest payments on debt that was owed to it, right? Yep. So I mean, this is some of the complexity in there, and also there's geopolitical posturing, the fact that there's a new kid on the block.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope everyone checks out the fantastic report from April, Life or Debt, the Stranglehold of Neocolonialism in Africa, Search for Alternatives, from the Tri-Continental Institute for Social Research, where you, Grieve Shewa, are a senior fellow. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us some of your very precious time, I'm sure, here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, Eugene and Rania, for having me. Fantastic pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move right along here. Excellent report.
Can I say one thing? Can I say one thing before we move along?
I mean, yes, you can.
Well, I just wanted to berate our viewers real quick in between guests that I have noticed there are 203 people watching the live stream. However, only 124 have clicked the like button. Therefore, for those who have not yet clicked the like button, please do. I'm getting angry. No, I'm just joking. But please do. It helps the algorithm.
Maybe you are. Stick with that. Stick with anger.
I will absolutely throw a temper tantrum during this live stream. Actually, no, because people might want me to do that. So they might actually withhold the like in that case. So please like the program.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's an important PSA. Let's turn the page here to unionization in the United States, galloping forward in a number of places, this time at YouTube. We are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Katie Marie Marshner, who is a member organizer for the Alphabet Workers Union, Communications Workers of America, Local 9009. Katie, thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here with us. And I mean, I think some people certainly saw this story towards the end of last month. YouTube music workers, 41-0 voted to unionize. Talk to us about, who are the YouTube music workers? What are they doing? And why did they want to unionize in the first place? And, well, maybe give us that framework.
Sure. I think it's important to, start with distinguishing ourselves from full-time Google employees. Our group that unionized is actually a group of subcontractors through a company called Cognizant. And that's like a very typical model for large tech companies. They have their full-time employees. I think we see a lot of what their workplaces look like, big lavish offices in downtown of really nice and desirable cities. But there's like a whole shadow workforce that these companies also utilize, and they're in the form of subcontractors, temporary workers, and vendors. And I fall into that category. So we are a pretty hidden workforce. I think it's really easy when you use these types of platforms like Spotify or YouTube Music, Netflix, anything like that, to just think that these things kind of run on their own, like some developer designs them and then they just kind of run. But there's actually like a group of, hidden workers that are ensuring that you receive the highest quality product possible. So we fall into that group. We decided to unionize because we learned that there was a union that we could join. So we were reached out to by a full-time employee, just letting us know like there's a union and temporary vendor and contract workers are allowed to join it. So we started attending meetings, started hearing about other issues that people were unionizing around, and realized pretty quickly on that we had a really good case. We had some issues around pay. We were all hired remotely during the pandemic. There were only about 8 people who ever worked in a physical office, and then the team grew to about 68 over the course of the pandemic. And we were starting to get, whispers about a return to office. And for most of us, we are not making enough for a commute to be feasible. The office is located on the outskirts of Austin, pretty far away from where most people live if you live in Austin. There's the issue of childcare, all those types of things. It just wouldn't be feasible. In addition to that, we also have about 20% of our workforce just entirely living outside of Austin. So either in surrounding areas in Texas, maybe they were hired out of state in Florida or in California. And the company basically said, if you don't return on this date, you are abandoning your job. So we decided that we needed to form a union to protect our positions and to just have a say in these types of like major decisions that would impact our livelihoods.
And when it comes to labor victories like this, it's obviously fantastic for the workers that are immediately impacted. But does this also maybe have a spillover positive benefit for like tech workers in general? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly hope so. Like, I think for a long time, people think of tech workers as, financially stable, again, working in really cool offices and in exciting environments. But we've seen the mass layoffs at Google and at other giant tech companies. And we know that the landscape is shifting. Even Google announced that their workers were expected to share desks. There's just little things like basic dignity, having your own space, having your own personal effects on your desk. I think we certainly hope that more people are inspired to unionize, specifically the TVCs, the temporary vendor and contract workers. They are given less benefits, their pay is significantly less. They're it's a 2-tiered system entirely. And we hope that our case inspires them. We did win a joint employer status, so we were able to prove to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, that Google is also an employer of us. And so we really hope that this is precedent setting and that people are inspired to follow suit and to establish these massive tech companies as their employer and to be able to bargain with them as well.
No, I mean, I think that's critically important, especially the joint employer rule. I mean, it has a big impact on everyone. People who don't know this is McDonald's workers, same thing. There are all these big corporations that are trying to pretend they don't actually employ you however they can so they don't have to actually find anything. And it seems like this is, and I think you're speaking to it to a degree. I mean, really, the reality versus the hype of the tech industry. I mean, it seems to me that the issue of de-skilling, the role of AI, the use of contractors, the abuse of the immigration system. I mean, that in many ways these are actually some of the worst employers. I mean, I even remember I had a friend who worked at a tech company and actually paid pretty well, and they were saying to me oh, I'm always here because we have this, we have that, and I was like, how long are you working every week? And they were like, 90 hours. And I thought oh, well, it sounds good because they have a ball pit there. But then you realize, well, wait a second, they're actually taking almost your entire life. So it almost feels like the thing that I really appreciate about this win is it helps pull back the veil on, these big companies that I think many people feel are they're not the Fords, they're not the GMs, they're not these evil employers of the past.
Yeah, totally. I think social media, it's really easy to think wow, what a cool company. Look at this office. There's massage tables and free kombucha. But yeah, those are historically traps to get people to not leave, to not take a lunch. We'll give you lunch. You stay at your desk, you eat, you don't leave. It's all kind of just a veil of okay, well, we'll squeeze more labor out of you if we just give you these small concessions. And in reality, there's so many studies that show people are more productive at home. Their mental health is better, which helps you be a better worker. We don't need these offices and we don't need free kombucha. We just need a living wage and freedom and flexibility and a say, just a say. Like my life should not change because of the stroke of a billionaire's pen, and that's just the bottom line. Like I've been a good employee. I have worked my way up through the small ladder that is available to me in this subcontracting world. I show up on time, I'm in all my meetings. So why is it that just because someone woke up and decided, hey, we want a little more control over these folks, do I have to put my dog in daycare all day and, let my basic necessities kind of go by the wayside with no even, I think it wouldn't be much of a different conversation, but it's also just there's no talk of a raise for folks. We heard from our subcontractor Cognizant, well, the company is just not doing well. And then we see they have an F1 car and we look up how much that costs. And it's just kind of come on now. Even if we were having this discussion, I think it would be different if you were offering us a raise, because at this point now we're just getting a pay cut and we haven't seen a raise with inflation. So that's another pay cut. And they've threatened to move our work overseas. So it really just comes down to dignity. You don't respect us. And so we will force you to.
You kind of laid out a few of the things that may be able to change now that you're unionized, but can you elaborate on that a bit? What can now, as unionized workers, you have rights to, and also what can you put your maybe that prevent is the right word, but there now will be obstacles in the way of being treated this or that way?
Yes, absolutely. I think I guess it might help just to explain our case and the hurdles that are in front of us. Because we decided to file joint employer status, I guess we decided to do that because we understood very quickly that our subcontractor Cognizant, if we wanted to negotiate over pay, they could say, well, that's actually set by Google, our client. Or if we wanted to negotiate over work from home, they could say, well, Google's worried about security of their information, so that's why you have to be in an office. So we kind of realized they're just going to scapegoat each other if we don't get them both here. But that just creates a lot of delay and barriers in the way of getting some of those benefits that you were speaking of. Currently, Google is appealing the NLRB's ruling of joint employer status, so that will now go to the national board. It's likely that they'll rule in our favor. They can't make the evidence disappear, right? So then they'll appeal it again, and it'll go to the Fifth Circuit, and they'll just keep appealing it. It's probably... I don't have a crystal ball, but it will probably be a year before we even know who is our employer, right? But once we get to that point, we would begin contract negotiations, and that's where we can really get some of those wins that you were detailing. Everything is up for negotiation: pay, benefits, how promotions are handled, how sexual harassment and different issues in the workplace are handled. At the moment, we could reach out to HR and they hate us. I mean, they truly hate us. They treat us disrespectfully. They speak to us in a really nasty tone. They don't take us seriously. So we'll have a say in how these things are handled, in our pay, in our working conditions, where we work from. So pretty much everything. The sky is the limit once we get to that point. But there are a lot of hurdles that we have to cross before we get there, unfortunately.
No, absolutely. And as we know, a very significant number of companies, I wish I had the stat on top of my head, are violating the law on a regular basis to stop workers from exercising their right to unionize. But Kate and Marie, tell me this: if someone is watching this and they are somewhere in the alphabet universe and thinking, we also would like to have more of a say on the job, how do they find what's going on with the Alphabet Workers Union CWA Local 9009?
You can go straight to the Alphabet Workers Union website. It's alphabetworkers.org. There's information there. We have a Calendly. You can set up a meeting with an organizer. They'll sit down and hear about whatever issues you're facing and give you some guidance on where to begin. There's trainings that you can attend for free through the website. we have a code training pretty much every weekend. And in that training, you'll learn about labor history. You'll learn how to have one-on-one conversations with your coworkers and kind of the basic strategy around getting to a contract negotiation. So building out your organizing committee, having those one-on-one conversations, doing structure tests to see where people stand, getting cards signed. So there's a lot of free resources there and a lot of people who want to help. So that's a great place to start.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Well, Katie Marie Marshner, member organizer for the Alphabet Workers Union, congratulations to you on the victory, and thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you guys are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Have a good
Yeah, really an amazing victory there. Obviously, Alphabet is like the biggest company in America, and they're doing everything possible. But slowly but surely, things are happening. Code CWA, the whole CWA campaign in the tech industry is killing it right now. I think people, if you check out what they're doing, you'd be surprised. But video game companies, Alphabet, all of them, they're everywhere organizing these tech workers and getting a lot of wins. And yeah, I mean, I'll just say this before we move on. People always can say, "Oh, well, aren't they high?" Well, look. Longshoremen are highly paid too, and they deserve to be. You know what I mean? There's no crime in being highly paid, and that's the real thing that we have to, I think, move away from. Is that somehow it's a crime to have a salary that you can actually not just survive on but thrive on. Apparently, that's just reserved for billionaires and hundreds of millionaires who are CEOs. But that's what labor unions are all about, really, is redistributing the wealth in a way that is significantly more fair. So. Big win there, could be significant. And the legal precedents that she's mentioning there around the joint employer rule are critically important, because this is what every franchisor, fast food restaurant, or whatever is using to prevent low-wage workers from organizing as well. So that issue of what it means to be working for essentially a franchisee or a contractor under a big company could potentially have a huge impact on the economy and certainly on workers, especially the lowest wage workers and the most exploited people, independent contractors, truckers, for instance. This is a huge issue. So even though we're talking about YouTube Music, this victory and the legalities around it could have a huge impact, from truckers to people working at Burger King. So worth watching there. Well, let's stick with the labor movement, Rania.
Yes.
Let's move now to a company that everyone also knows in addition to Alphabet, and that is UPS, and the potentiality there for some significant labor battles, perhaps. Maybe they'll come to their senses. But we are very honored as we continue the show to be joined by Mike Kramer, who's a labor organizer and the executive vice president of Unite Here Local 26 in Boston, the Boston area. Mike, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Eugene. Hi, Rania. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you on, and we wanted to bring you on. You wrote an interesting article recently for Liberation News about the potentiality of a UPS strike coming up later this year. Big contract. Obviously, it's a company, we all know UPS. Many of us remember the 1997 strike. So maybe just give us some framing for, what exactly is taking place here. I mean, why are UPS workers so fed up, and what's going on in terms of what could potentially happen later this year?
Sure. I think it'd be useful to step back to start out, and I think the example of the YouTube Music workers shows that we're really in a moment of, I don't know if you can accurately describe it yet as labor upsurge, but a real increase in the popularity of unions. There's a survey that gets cited a lot that notes that union popularity is at a peak since the 1960s. We're seeing organizing at Starbucks, organizing of tech workers. There's a wave of organizing of academic workers. And we've also seen strikes largely concentrated in the public sector, mostly in education. But what we haven't yet seen is collective action from workers that really has an impact on the economy as a whole. And I think that's what we may be seeing in the near future with a conflict between United Parcel Service and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. I think the reason for that is a few things. First, this is a national contract that covers UPS workers across the entire country. It covers about 350,000 workers, people working in every state, city, and town. And secondly, this is this is an industry that's really at the core of the economy. UPS itself likes to put out a statistic that I quoted in the article that the equivalent of 6% of the national GDP moves through their system every single day. And so you can imagine with a potential strike that affects that has an impact that goes well beyond an individual employer or an individual industry.
Oh, I don't know, Rania, if
Sorry, my my page went away and I didn't know if like something happened to the internet. No, that's a really good point. Is there's so much leverage here, and those numbers are important. I think something in the article, something you mentioned is that something like 2% of like the global economy is actually impacted by what UPS touches, or does in the U.S. alone, and then also just the number of workers and impacts, and also like the geography itself. Like you're talking about something national, and then Eugene mentioned in the opening this 1997 strike, and I'm curious if that kind of like in the background plays a role in sort of reminding the corporate bosses like what is at stake for them if they don't come to the negotiating table with like actually like proper ideas and willingness to compromise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 1997 strike is very present in everything that's happening. There are, I said in the article, that there are a lot of echoes of that strike. First, in the issues that are being raised, and in 1997, that strike was largely around the issue of access to full-time work. There was the slogan that was put out was part-time America doesn't work, and the demand raised by the striking workers was a real path to full-time jobs that were good family-sustaining jobs, and that demand had a real importance in making the 1997 strike not just a fight of UPS workers, but really a fight of all workers. It was a demand that spoke to what workers in every industry were feeling. And I think we're seeing something similar here with the things that are being raised by the workers in their union in this set of negotiations. Issues like health and safety, which are felt everywhere, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and issues based simply around pay. And every worker in every city and town is feeling the effects of inflation right now, and what has historically been a good job as a UPS package car driver is the threat of that no longer being a good job is very present and deeply felt. And one thing that's made that even more deeply felt is the potential two-tiering of the workforce. The last contract, the contract that's about to expire, which has some features that are very, very unpopular. One of those being the creation of a second tier of package car drivers that's lower paid, has less contractual rights, and the union has made the elimination of that second tier a key to its program.
One of the things that I'm sure we can expect here, Mike, as we always hear from these big corporations, is somehow they have no money whatsoever, and this is just they're really good people, and this is all they can do. And of course UPS will say, well, Amazon this, Amazon that, so we have to bring in whatever concessions they want the workers to take. But what do we know? I mean, I don't know. As far as I know, UPS seems to be making a lot of money. But what do we know about those issues, and how do you respond to some of those things that we know are going to be put out there from a propaganda perspective by the company as we get closer and closer to the contract expiring?
Yeah, I think we can expect all of those things and more in the case that UPS tries to make to the public. But what we do know is that last year they had record profits, 2022 was $11.3 billion in profits for the company. So it seems like they're doing just fine. I know that they are forecasting a slower year this year, but when you're slowing down from $11.3 billion in profits, it doesn't seem like you're hurting exactly. And of course, they're going to point to Amazon as the competition that is out there, and the Teamsters and the rest of the labor movement are paying attention to Amazon as well, and I think that's going to be a key issue in this fight. And some of the potential that exists here, which is, can this transform not just into a contract fight that sustains and improves the working conditions of the 350,000 workers of UPS, but can this be one of those moments that leads to more workers seeing that and saying, hey, that should be us too, understanding the power that they have, and particularly workers at Amazon, which is absolutely something that the new leadership of the Teamsters have had their eye on. President Sean O'Brien has been very vocal in his intention to take on Amazon, and I think their view is that begins with this contract fight at UPS, and I think it's going to be up to all of us to make this that kind of fight, a fight of all working people that inspires more organizing in the shipping and logistics industry, certainly, but beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good point, because if Amazon and UPS are going to point fingers at each other to justify like why their companies have to treat their workers so poorly, it only makes sense for workers at those two places to be uniting to have the labor rights they deserve. But on that note, what can people who are watching do? I mean, this is obviously like a huge workforce here. You're talking 350,000 people, which is a very strong number of people. But for those who obviously support their UPS drivers, and like the UPS driver, is seen as like a mailman type figure that's sort of beloved by the people in the neighborhood for the most part, because they're always bringing you packages. What can those who are watching do to support this effort?
Yeah, well, the union is in negotiations right now. Negotiations began in April, and the current collective bargaining agreement expires at the end of July. So I think these next few months are really going to be a critical period to make sure that UPS workers know that they're not alone in this fight, and that it's going to be that there are going to be people standing with them. And I think that can start with things as simple as kind of what I think you're alluding to, Rania, which is having conversations, making sure you do know your UPS driver, who's delivering to your home or your workplace every day, and making sure that you're regularly letting them know that you and others are going to be standing with them if they get into a fight here. I think beyond that, it's only a matter of time before this turns into a fight that has a more public element. And as soon as those calls begin going out for rallies and public actions to put pressure on this company, I think it's up to all of us to show that that's not just going to be the Teamsters and UPS workers who are going to be taking on this corporate giant, but that there are going to be people all over the country standing with them and having their back, whether that's forming local solidarity committees, whether that's making phone calls, whatever the union is calling for. I think that's going to be up to all of us to support.
Well, if we can judge by Sean O'Brien's appearance in front of Congress, the Teamsters are feeling scrappy. So it'll be interesting to follow. But Mike, great piece. UPS workers prepare for historic showdown with corporate giant by Mike Kramer on liberationnews.org about this UPS fight. Mike, thank you so much for being willing to join us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, amazing thing. I should have asked him about this, and we lost him. They had local Unite here at Local 26 had a big win at Northeastern recently, by the way. A couple other big wins there in the Boston area, fighting very hard for their their workers and their members as well. So, another example of the, big push that we're seeing around labor victories all over. I wish I would have asked him this. It was I think they're getting $30 an hour now. It was a big win. But nonetheless, important issue, one to watch. I can certainly remember the 1997 strike. It's one of the first big memories I have of the news.
Really?
My parents were really supporting that strike, and so it was always on the news every single day. And then we went down there to where they were striking, to the picket line. So I hope I don't have to go back this time, because I hope that UPS comes to their senses. But anyway. You
never know with these people. I can't help but whenever I hear Boston, I just think of The Town.
Yeah. Well, The Town is, as you know, one of my favorite movies.
Movie.
And if you've never heard Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, talk, he's like a Southie guy. So the first time I ever heard him talk was that Congress hearing. And I don't know what I was expecting, but I just did not expect it to be like a Southie guy. And I was like, oh my God, it's like The Town or something.
Such a good movie.
Yeah. Well, typically Ben Affleck is a supporter of unions and other progressive causes. So maybe we'll see him say something positive.
Yeah, or get him on the show. Get him on the Freedom Side.
Yes.
Come on the show, Ben Affleck.
Yeah.
Formal invitation.
I would love to have him on there. I thought he had the best commercial of the Super Bowl too, but that's debatable.
Because it wasn't promoting cryptocurrency. That's why.
Well, it was promoting really Dunkin' Donuts. Is that better? I really don't know.
Better than crypto. Yeah. You know what? It's better than crypto.
It is better than crypto. I just thought it was the funniest of all of them. I thought the other best one was Bud Light, but we see that they're tanking, so I guess it didn't help them. But nevertheless, a lot to be watching here in the labor movement.
First celebrity segment on the Freedom Side.
We can talk about that. Listen, so if you have any big celebrity news you want to drop on me, now's the time. Ryan.
Next up, J-Lo and Ben Affleck. Are they really happy? They do.
To tie in some elements from this show, I was actually 4 months ago in a parking lot of a McDonald's, or walking through the parking lot, and J-Lo was there eating some McDonald's, and I was accosted by her driver, who thought somehow I was trying to come over and talk to her, and was like, excuse me, she just wants to eat lunch in peace. And I was like, yes, as do I, sir. I'm going
so do
to
I.
But nonetheless,
must be nice to walk around the world with security detail.
And you know what? Look, he was just doing his job, so I'm not hating. But anyway, let's move forward to another issue that has some labor ties. People may have seen President of the Amazon Labor Union, Chris Smalls, was recently in Cuba. There are a number of people who were there recently, including 150 young people here from the United States who are a part of a youth delegation organized by the International People's Assembly. And we are very honored to be joined to hear a little bit more about that by Cameron Hurt, who is a coordinator with the International People's Assembly here in the North America region. Cameron Hurt, thank you so much for being with us, sir.
Thank you. Honored to be here. Eugene and Rania. It's good to be back.
Well, my first question for you is, why was it important for you to be a part of, not just going yourself, but organizing this delegation of young people to go to Cuba now at this time?
It's an essential time. For the past 60 years, the U.S. has been unjustly, illegally, genocidally blockading Cuba, doing its best to smear Cuba in the press, doing its best to make Americans afraid of Cuba. But the truth is, no matter how many times they try to do this, no matter how many times they tried to intimidate, people know that Cuba is our friend. People know that Cuba has done nothing but try to support us since the revolution. People know that Cuba is a place where people from around the world are able to study medicine, to live peacefully, and to really resist U.S. empire against all odds, truly, only 90 miles away from the United States. I think Cuba is a beacon that kind of shows what is possible. So the U.S.'s strategy is keep people away from Cuba, make it difficult to travel. Trump imposed 247 new sanctions, blocks people from bringing even, these big cultural products of alcohol and tobacco back. So all of this is meant to distance these people. So the International People's Assembly, of which I am, an organizer, a coordinator of this brigade, was able to plan a 10-day brigade there that included over 150 people, young people, particularly from all corners of the country. We joined other delegations who were there as well. And it consisted of over 40 organizations, which was an incredible show of unity that, the People's Forum, BYP 100, Palestinian Youth Movement, Black Men Build, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Code Pink, Unión de Vecinos, and so many other organizations really stood together in solidarity. And I know that it was probably incredibly emotional today for these young organizers to have to return, to say goodbye to those that they met. But the hope is that we will see a day within our lifetimes that it'll be way easier to go to Cuba, that there's not all of these restrictions, and that these relationships can truly continue and blossom.
Cameron, it sounds like the trip was amazing. I was, of course, following the various social media posts about it. And it looked like really effective, too, in a sense of there's some people who've never been to Cuba who got to go. Eugene mentioned Chris Smalls, quite a high-profile figure. I'd like to hear more about what happened on the trip. And you all were there for May Day, of course, International Labor Day that we pretend doesn't exist in the U.S. But I also wanted to ask you about the fact that on the way back into the U.S., I saw that several people who were on this trip were taken for secondary questioning and were harassed and basically interrogated by Border and Customs. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, so I can definitely answer both of those. We were in Cuba for May Day, so International Workers' Day, which has a long tradition, a long history, and May 1st was the day of celebration. So on May Day, we were received by the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, a great friend of the people, and many organizations had the chance to declare statements and show solidarity, show support. So that was a beautiful thing. Cuba, on one side, opening its doors to young people, organizers from all types of backgrounds who are fighting police brutality in the United States, who are fighting for immigrant rights, for housing rights, for women's rights, for reproductive rights, all of these things together, while our own government does its best to slander and distance these movements. And we had a lot of political discussions with Cubans from all across the island about everything from Cuba's revolutionary project to the movements for justice in the US to our shared fight against imperialism. People were able to visit the Latin American Medical School, which Breakthrough has done amazing coverage of, which was built to serve, aspiring medical professionals, doctors from all across the country, all across the world as well, whether it's Latin America, the United States, even people from Palestine, many doctors being trained there, and all at no cost. So these types of amazing advances were witnessed by these young people who can now go back and be honest, be truthful about what they saw and what they experienced. We were also able to exchange with representatives of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as Afro-Cuban organizations and students and professors, popular education groups, scientists, athletes, construction workers. It was truly meant to show what is Cuban society like on every single level. And I think that was an incredible success. People learned a lot. People are coming back with a lot. And they're coming back, most importantly, with hope that this can be done and that the United States can transform radically, that it can change, and that socialism is the way forward, verifiably. And as well as the need to end the blockade. I think it's incredibly important that all of these young people are walking away with a sense of duty, that this is our role, living in the United States in the belly of the beast. So all of that was amazing. The spirit of the trip was incredibly high. I know that on the last day, there were so many hugs and smiles and phone numbers exchanged, and it was very sad to see everyone go. But at the same time, as we returned to the belly of the beast, there was a very, very unfair, unjust, and terrible, disgusting searching of people's phones, detention at these airports. And despite the fact that we were traveling legally, we were harassed, and a lot of people went into secondary questioning when they arrived to their airports. And this is really disgusting behavior that is meant to intimidate people, to discourage people from wanting to go back, and to just harass and make it a difficult process to get in and out of Cuba. So Cuba is one of the countries that's treated in this particular way because of the path that it has chosen. And after the hours of harassment and intimidation, really terrible things, all the comrades who were able to go did return home. So we really appreciate how much love and solidarity was exchanged and shown across the world, because at the end of the day, this type of harassment is not going to be something that stops or slows down the movement at all. In fact, it fires all of us up to continue to resist this blockade, to continue to educate around it and show people that Cuba has something to offer, which is incredibly powerful. And we want to just make it clear that we have the right to travel to Cuba and exchange with it. Everything we did was legal. We were following the processes. So if this is the route that, the Customs and Border Patrol want to take, if they think that that is going to help them achieve their goals, then they have something else coming, which is that we are going to continue this type of work. We want to continue these types of brigades. And if anything, we want to come back bigger next time.
Just give us a sense of some of the impacts of the blockade that you were able to witness.
Well, I think one of the most severe ways that it was shown this time, this is my third time being in Cuba, but there is a drastic fuel shortage at this moment. So this is something that, everyone from all levels of society were willing to admit. This is not something that was hidden, but, Cuba was having to operate on less than half of what they normally need to function. So it was very, very difficult. You would even see, long lines to get gas. And this is not because socialism is a problem or because socialism leads to this type of scarcity. It's because of this inhumane type of blockade that attempts to make it very difficult for Cuba to purchase anything from outside. Cuba's not a producer of oil, so it really needs that type of trade and it needs that type of support. But the U.S.'s goal is to make life incredibly difficult. People can go back to the Mallory Memorandum, which made it clear that every measure possible was going to be taken by the U.S. government to make life in Cuba severely difficult, to make things hard for people so that hopefully the people would rise up and get rid of Castro. And now I suppose they're hoping that they'll somehow get rid of Miguel Diaz-Canel. But that is not the reaction of the masses of Cuban people. It's not a reaction of let us now blame the government. People are very much aware and understanding that what's needed is the end of the blockade. What's needed is this type of brigade. And if anything, it's a testament to that even in this deep fuel shortage, they were willing to host, 150 young people from the United States. It goes to show that the internationalism is baked deep into the revolution, that this wasn't just something that they were going to cancel because of difficult times. And believe, Cuba truly is in a difficult time at this point. But they know that revolutionary solidarity is actually the only way that the project will be successful. And of course, the blockade affects everyday Cubans in so many other ways, from, the blocking of medical supplies, exchanges of knowledge, and, at every single level, we see the blockade trying to force poverty onto the people of Cuba. But every single day that we are, fighting to organize to end the blockade is a day closer to that victory where there can finally be this bridge between the two countries that allows for all types of exchange, from education, healthcare, medicine, science, and all of the other factors that are necessary.
It truly is astonishing. I mean, you mentioned the 243 sanctions that Trump added against Cuba, but Trump is not president anymore, right? It's like Joe Biden is president right now, and he was vice president under Obama, who had normalized relations with Cuba, which Trump undid. I'm just curious, I've been to Cuba I've had the privilege to go to Cuba a couple times in the last year, including just a couple months ago. But I'm curious if that was a conversation that was being had, the fact that under this Democratic administration, you still have the Trump policies in place with really no attempt whatsoever or interest in undoing them.
Right, exactly. Some may have been surprised and some not so much that Joe Biden decided to keep all of the measures that Trump had imposed. And it may have been surprising to some, given that his president that he used to work for, Obama, did make some moves to, ease some of the tensions, although, of course, not lifting the blockade completely, which was definitely necessary at the time. It's been necessary. And truly, it's such a deeply unfair kind of thing. Like, the United States is essentially saying, we're going to just cheat at this game because there's no other way to win. We can't treat Cuba like a regular country. We can't just let it blossom in the way that it does. And if socialism works for them, then good for them. The United States clearly doesn't believe in sovereignty, whether it's, George Bush, whether it's Bill Clinton before him, or Trump and Biden. They're clearly on the same page when it comes to this. So we definitely were able to discuss that, and that the president at this moment is not willing to make any type of concession Of course, Joe Biden's deeply anti-communist, deeply afraid of people's movements, and someone who is trying to hold society back in a policy that was created in 1960 that goes decades back. So we know that these things are being upheld, and if anything, like when deep tragedies struck Cuba in the past couple of years, whether it was the fire at a storage facility in Matanzas, or whether it was the hurricanes that have been hitting the United States, keeps its hands behind its back. It pretends that it can't do anything to help, and that if anything, it's the Cuban government's fault that destruction and devastation are taking place. And the only way that the United States would ever offer support would be with a different government in Cuba. But that's not going to happen. So ultimately, it's on us, people who are fighting right here on this continent, to make sure that this ends. There's absolutely no greater task that we have when it comes to the Cuba Solidarity Movement, because when we go talk to people, they say, regardless of what your ideology is as a person in the United States, regardless of what you believe in, whether you believe in socialism, whether you agree with Fidel Castro, whether you agree with the current government, all that we're asking for is that you fight to end the blockade. In other words, like, they can handle a lot of, whatever issues are rising in their society. They don't need, the United States coming to lecture them about different problems. They know the problems well. They know what needs to be worked on, but a blockade is an absolutely criminal and inhumane thing to impose on a person and on a country. So we came back at least with a sense of duty that our task is very, very clear, and that 150 young people are going to now do everything in our ability to build a future and break the blockade.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Cameron, if there's anyone who saw this, who's curious to learn more about what's happening and, perhaps how they can link up with these 150 young people, where should they go?
Well, we really, really encourage folks to get involved, to do whatever work possible, in your own community, to educate about Cuba, to educate about the blockade, and really highlight for people how inhumane this is. But if you want to follow on social media, we encourage you to look up International People's Assembly. We have a website, ipa-aip.org. All of our materials are typically translated, so you can find both, the Spanish and English on Instagram or on Twitter or on just the website as well. So we really want people to get involved in this movement. This is something that's going to require not only hundreds, not only thousands, but millions of people activated and ready to build a new future that's worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm. Cameron Hurt, coordinator with the International People's Assembly. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Take care.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pleasure is all ours, you might say. No, it's very, very interesting looking delegation, it seems. And I know the People's Forum social media has a lot of good videos and things like that for those who are, curious to see what took place there. Rania, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I said yes, they did, and they had a fantastic Instagram posts, which, Eugene, if you had Instagram, you could have seen, but you don't. So,
and I feel great about that.
Well,
don't need to know everything that's going on. What can I say? Anyway, long story short, I don't know. Go to Instagram or one of them and figure out what's going on there. We also have Instagram too, at BT Newsroom, but
we do.
Yeah,
Eugene
we have TikTok too, also at BT Newsroom.
Trying to change the subject to the fact that he doesn't have an Instagram.
It's not changing the subject.
I think you kind of are, but okay. All right.
I am going to change the subject now. I mean, I'm going to do
more
that.
important
I just
stuff.
also want to shout out a couple people who have donated. David, shout out to you, and Anonymous, whoever you are, you know who you are. Shout out to you for your donation as well. Really appreciate you guys. And don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/breakthroughnews and become an ongoing donor here for Breakthrough, which is critically important for us to be able to keep coming to you. So patreon.com/breakthroughnews, great place for you to go. There's all sorts of great things. Exclusive content from Rania Khalek's Dispatches. I'm doing a monthly seminar on Africa issues. We have many, many different things that you can have there. We've got many more things that are coming to you. And the more patrons we have, the more we can do and the more we can offer to you. So go to patreon.com/breakthroughnews, become an ongoing donor. It will be greatly, greatly appreciated, and it'll help push us forward in a big way. Well,
so Eugene.
Yes.
Oh, well, I was just going to segue with something, because I know we're going to talk about what, according to many U.S. media outlets, was an inside job in Russia. We're allowed to call it an inside job when it happens in Russia, by the way. That's what I've learned
False flag.
from false flag, inside job, all those things, all those words are totally fine to say when we're talking about Russia. We're going to get to that. But before I do get to that, I was actually reading up before we were recording just to see how the media is like covered what happened outside the Kremlin yesterday with the bombs going off.
Yes.
Well,
while
I
you
did
say
come
this,
across,
talking about how it's covered, I think we actually have an AP headline that we could put up between us as you talk.
Wait, can I just have to, before we go to that, I just need to read you a headline that I saw while coming across the headlines about the Kremlin at the New York Times, which is not about the Russia thing, but is worth stating right now. Are you ready for this, Eugene? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. This is a New York Times headline. How U.S. efforts to guide Sudan to democracy ended in war.
Guess that's one way to look at it.
I mean, we don't have to get into that right now, but that, I mean, wow.
It's definitely, honestly, if you replace democracy with like U.S. backed fake democracy, you'd be right in a way. I mean, the U.S. role. I mean, the reason we are exactly where we are, quite frankly, is that the U.S. empowered both of these individuals. You know, the General Al Burhan and Mr. Hemeti to become leaders of the country because they were worried that this huge mass movement that had evicted Omar al-Bashir, the current president, was going to wipe out all these people. And so they cut a deal with the U.S. to normalize relations with Israel, to back the World Bank and the IMF, to back this ridiculous war in Ethiopia, to destabilize the government there. So really, this whole thing that brought these people to the position of power they're in is actually the U.S. efforts in the country, but it wasn't really democracy. So there's
another way to put what you just said, Eugene, and that's the subheading. Everything you just said could also be stated this way. Critics say the Biden administration and its partners were naive about the intentions of two rival generals and failed to empower civilian leaders.
I mean, it's honestly amazing that you can even write that. I mean, it's not shocking, but it's like you have to be actually willfully ignorant in order to write that. Like, I don't know who the New York Times writer was of that piece, but I'm sure they're not dumb. You know, I'm sure they're actually probably relatively well educated, but you have to be willfully ignorant to believe that the United States, who's been deeply, deeply involved in Sudan for many, many years, was naive. I mean, they knew exactly who these people were.
Well, the correspondents that took three people were reported this. At least one of them was on the U.S. Secretary of State's plane. So I imagine this is just like a lot. And one of the reporters is Declan Walsh, who
of course,
I don't know anybody who follows any
Declan
war
Walsh
anywhere.
Is an absolute propagandist. I mean, his only role
100%.
is to show up in Africa and report what Western intelligence agencies want people.
Hey,
to know
he did it in
Africa.
Syria too. I'm not sure if he ever went, but he did that on Syria.
Yeah,
these people
total mercenary.
100%. I'm sorry. I know we're going to be talking about the Kremlin right now. I saw that headline. I thought you'd really appreciate it. I was like, wow, that's a stunner. It's one way to put it.
Unfortunate situation. And honestly, actually getting worse today in Sudan. So I guess we're playing these little games here in the Western media, but it's actually, and the thing is, it's about to move off the headlines of the West, you know, because all the foreigners are being evacuated. So once that's all over, I think, and this is the expectation of people on the ground in Sudan, that it's actually going to intensify. There's, you know, the military mobilizing rallies there today. There's all sorts of allegations of people recruiting people to new armed groups, what the potential impact is going to be. Libya, Chad, Egypt, you know, all being either injecting themselves in or being drawn in. Very tough situation. I think it's difficult to see exactly where it's going to end. But the U.S. now is trying to shift the framing when they're trying to set up their own so-called mechanism. I don't know why they call these things mechanisms, to subsume all of the peace plans that have been promoted. Different countries have been trying to promote their own different peace plans. IGAD, which is the regional organization, South Sudan trying to put one together. Egypt, I think, had offered, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Some of the Gulf states. So you had multiple different areas. Now the U.S. is going to try to control the whole thing. And it's worth remembering that the U.S. interjected themselves in the Ethiopian peace negotiations in order to make sure that their former proxy, the TPLF, got what they wanted. So obviously they're trying to manipulate this process in such a way to make sure whatever negotiations do take place or don't take place, you know, as it concerns what's happening in Sudan are ultimately governed by the U.S. Now, whether or not they'll succeed is a whole other question because they've already been doing this. There's something called the trilateral mechanism, which is dominated by the United States, that was allegedly supposed to be brokering a so-called return to democracy that actually ended up in the current war that we're in right now. So I don't know if anything's going to get off the ground. Every day there's a new ceasefire, and every day it doesn't really work. So difficult to say. I've seen more and more international media now also leaving the country, which in and of itself is says something about where things are there. So Darfur, which is not as much in the headlines as Khartoum, things getting very, very dicey there, and it seems like there's a possibility of some overflow of conflicts from the past coming back to the forefront. So I would say Sudan is a country people should continue to watch and continue to look at closely. And
just not at the New York Times. Just maybe not at the New York Times.
No, definitely not at the New York Times.
Speaking of which, I do apologize I know we wanted to talk about what happened at the Kremlin. I know there was a headline you wanted to show.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, obviously, thousands of people are dying in Sudan, so that's obviously more important than the back and forth over what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, which is to some degree only in the headlines because, of what's going on with the NATO proxy war. I mean, if NATO somehow was, I don't know, if Sudan was, I don't even know, somehow against NATO, this would be at a much higher level of the news. And I think that's an interesting thing about how the news, really works in terms of what's important. But the issue of the drone attack on the Kremlin did not actually really make it to the front pages. Everyone wrote about it in the U.S. media, but they stayed pretty low. Although internationally it was huge. I actually spent some time yesterday looking at Indian TV, and it was definitely the top story everywhere. But now the U.S., the thing is getting better. For people who don't know the story, basically, I don't even want to say allegedly because it doesn't seem allegedly, but yesterday there was a drone attack on the Kremlin. So the Russians have then accused the Ukrainians of trying to launch an assassination attempt against Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainians are saying, no, we did not do this. The U.S. is saying, the U.S. is saying a lot of different things. They're saying that they're not even sure that it's true, but as John Kirby said, whatever it was, we're not involved. And they've had people briefing the media saying we didn't know anything about any of this. I think, honestly, in a way, if you look at the media coverage, you have to really connect it to what happened with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and what happened with the Crimea bridge incident, where in both cases, the Ukrainians and in some cases the Americans were gloating, kind of doing the old Israeli wink, wink, nod, nod, like, oh, who knows who did this? That lets you know that they did it. But of course, especially with the Crimea bridge bombing, it really backfired on Ukraine. And many people around the world were critiquing them. The U.S., of course, is trying to maintain this fig leaf that they are not in a conflict with Russia. So, you have Karine Jean-Pierre saying yesterday at the White House press briefing, well, we don't encourage Ukraine to launch strikes in Russia. Now, obviously, we know that that's not the case because they've given them weapons that can do so, but they're obviously concerned that their own weapons and their own strategy and their own intelligence is going to be used in a way that will sort of that'll make it easier for Russia to argue on the international stage correctly that this is, the U.S. is essentially using Ukraine as a controlled proxy here. So I think they want to avoid what had happened before, which is the truth about what's really going on in this conflict, getting out, the fact that Ukraine is willing to use terrorist actions, but more importantly, the fact that the United States and the Ukrainian government are working very closely together on direct attacks on, critical infrastructure of allies like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline or the internal world of Russia, which allegedly they're not in. So it's interesting to see, but basically what's happening now is Ukraine is accusing Russia of setting this up as a false flag. They're saying that in the image that you can see between us is this image of these drones being blown up. I don't know if anyone's really doubting that now, but Ukraine is saying it's a false flag. Russia, of course, is saying it's not a false flag. America is saying no one has any idea, but as Anthony Blinken said, he takes everything with a giant shaker of salt that the Russians say. So, sort of soft backing the Ukrainians while not fully backing them. So it's obviously going to fade in relevance, vis-a-vis the U.S. media because it's going to be portrayed as a he said, she said, tit for tat. But I think in many ways it's an interesting escalation of the conflict. I mean, it's coming at the time that this so-called counteroffensive is supposed to come to the forefront. I mean, we've seen the car bombing that killed Daria Dugin, who is a prominent supporter of the Russian government. We saw the Crimea bridge bombing. We saw the bombing of the military blogger who was also killed recently in Russia. I've even actually seen some of these ridiculous pro-military think tanks, trying to push the Ukrainian government to try to actually like invade Russia and take over little small towns and stuff like that. So I think it speaks to the fact that I think we're really on the verge of a potential escalation. And this is the final thing I'll say about that. Right at the moment where the issue of the Ukraine-Russia grain deal is coming back to the forefront.
Yep.
They're negotiating right now whether or not to extend it really over the next couple of days in Turkey. Russia is demanding some things that seem, quite frankly, reasonable. But obviously that grain deal was critical to opening up to some degree the markets for many of these critical goods in the midst of a massive famine that's happening all over Africa, especially. And, Ukraine was saying, well, they wanted to help feed the world, and it was Russia was destroying them. But the vast majority of that Ukrainian grain has actually gone to Europe, by the way, and has destroyed the livelihoods of farmers in Europe by flooding it with cheap grain. It's actually been Russia who's been sending more of their grain and fertilizer to the countries in Africa that are struggling. But of course, you're never going to hear any of that. But it looks like the deal could break down, and that could have a huge impact on people around the world. But nonetheless, let's move to the other issue, which is a huge impact for sure, and that's the collapse of First Republic Bank, the possible collapse of other banks here in the United States, and of course the ripple effects that will have. And we are very honored to be joined here on the show by Chris Caruso, who's the operations director at the Kairos Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice. Chris, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the honor is all ours to have you. When we initially asked you to come on, we were talking about First Republic. Now it seems like there's a couple other banks that are here on the chopping block. We already had SVB. I mean, are we in a banking crisis here? And what does that mean if so?
Absolutely. We're in a rolling banking crisis. 3 of the 4 largest bank failures in U.S. history happened in the past 2 months, right? Wow. And although Biden has assured us that the banking system is safe and sound, there is already, after the restructuring of First Republic, of being gobbled up into JPMorgan Chase, now the largest bank with over 11% of all deposits in the country are now at this single bank, right? That in 2007, 2008, we were worried about banks being too big to fail. They're now bigger. And we've seen reflected in the stock prices of these other, mid-sized regional banks, banks like Western Alliance and PacWest, under extreme stress already. So we've not seen the end of this.
Okay, so I don't know if there's one answer to this, but what is causing this right now? Or what are the causes of this right now, I should say?
Yeah, well, I think that, if you want to know why this crisis is happening, it's always a good idea to look at how they tried to resolve the last crisis, right? And so when we had the Great Recession that starts in 2007, one of the biggest kind of policy response was that starting in 2009, we had this easy money regime where the Federal Reserve Bank pushed its lending rate down close to zero, the rate at which it lends money to other banks. And what this does by having this, cheap money, easy money regime go on for literally 13 years is, who does this benefit? Well, this cheap money regime benefits asset holders, right? What it does is it creates asset bubbles. In particular, it drives up the stock market, it drives up bonds, it drives up real estate. And for the richest 10% of the United States that own these assets in significant quantities, it's been a fantastically successful policy. For the bottom 90% of us, it's been an awful policy, right? And so, when we had the COVID crisis and began to have a bit of a recovery of this COVID crisis, and wages started to tick up a little bit, the response of the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, came out and said it directly: we must get wages down. Right? We must get wages down. And they, I think, are terrified about an incipient renewal of the labor movement in the United States. We've seen some recent victories, Amazon warehouse workers and others. And he came out and said directly, we are going to, raise interest rates, making it more expensive to borrow, slowing down economic growth because it's more expensive to borrow to expand a business. to start a new business, and we're gonna nip in the bud any kind of real independent motion of labor in the United States. And so, as they've begun to raise rates, what we've seen is that whole industries are dependent on this cheap money. That so many of the business models of Silicon Valley are dependent on this, virtually unending flow of very cheap money. And when it stopped, they went into crisis. As these interest rates went up to try to control inflation, to try to drive down wages, they found that there are dozens or hundreds of these zombie companies in Silicon Valley that only really can continue, they're not making profit, but they can continue to roll over by, just being able to continue to borrow cheap. And in fact, that was, it turns out, really many of these business models, right? If you think about, well, what was the business model of Uber? Well, we were told that the secret sauce was they had some special algorithm. They're going to route cars faster than anyone else could. Well, in reality, the special sauce was they had access to just tons and tons and tons of cheap funds coming out of Wall Street. And what they did is they used those funds to, undercut their competitors, right? The idea was that they would drive the taxis out of business, the car services, the livery services. They would use this cheap money to drive all their competitors out of business by offering below market rate rides. And then once they succeeded by using this, unending amounts of money to bash their competitors, they would then jack up prices and reap super profits. Well, Uber never quite got there because they flamed out, but many of the companies on Silicon Valley that tried to copy Uber's business model, it was just based on this very, very cheap access to money that is now gone. And so, We've seen, over 150,000 layoffs in the tech sector just in 2023 alone.
One of the things that was interesting to me about the way this was resolved in JPMorgan buying First Republic was that the so-called losses would be shared between JPMorgan and the federal government. I wonder what that share is going to look like. But the other element of that sort of bailout element of it did make me think of something else. I mean, the fact that this seems to be the way these things are resolved, just increasing banking consolidation, seems to also sort of directly increase the possibility that we'll face even more, pressure for these huge bailouts, because it's just creating more kind of too big to fail mentalities. And that the increasing concentration of the banking sector, and I'm sure it has a lot of problems, but that's one thing that I feel like, people are like, oh, JPMorgan, they bought it. It's over. It's been resolved, is the way it's being presented. But it seems like it's kind of setting us up for, just more and more of these situations where, the average working class person is asked to pony up our tax dollars for, someone else's, terrible gambling.
That's right. This is extend and pretend. This is just kick the can down the road and hope for the best, right? That we know that Biden's very proud of saying, quote unquote, this is not a bailout in the sense of direct, U.S. tax dollars going to the banks, but it is a bailout. In fact, all of these high net wealth depositors who had more than $250,000, that would be, the amount that's insured by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that they are getting bailed out 100%. The shareholders of the banks themselves are taking a hit. And the FDIC itself is taking a hit in terms of these losses. But these high income depositors are getting back 100% of their money. Now, who are these folks? The average American household, the median American household has $5,000 in the bank, right? So none of us were in danger of losing our assets, which are insured up to $250,000. But the combined force of the U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC says that this top 10% of asset holders should not lose any money in any circumstance, and they will deploy tens of billions of dollars to make sure that happens when they face losses. I mean, the FDIC, in terms of the work, the losses they took and the work they did to kind of restructure these assets to be taken over by JPMorgan and other banks, if you look at these past three major bank failures, it's $35 billion that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has put towards this restructuring.
Wow.
Right? This is not chump change. Now, Biden and them are saying, well, ultimately that money is going to be contributed by other banks. It's not coming directly from the taxpayer. So in that sense, it's not a direct bailout. But of course, what does it mean for an ordinary person? It means it's going to be harder to get a loan, and it's going to be more expensive to get a loan, right? And so this is these profound imbalances that are happening in our economy that, one of the things that all these three major bank failures had in common is that they served almost entirely high net worth individuals, right? That over 96% of the deposits at Silicon Valley Bank were over the $250,000 limit. Over 3/4 of the deposits at First Republic were over this $250,000 limit. And so, that's the priority, is making sure that those high net wealth individuals don't receive any losses when they're in their banking situation. And this, I think, strikes ordinary Americans as incredible. This is at the time when the pandemic, the benefits that were extended during the pandemics, things like the child tax credit, things like expanded access to Medicare, are all having the rug pulled out from under us. All of these benefits are ending. We know that we raised over 3 million people out of poverty with child tax credit and other programs during the pandemic. We know how to solve these problems. We just simply don't have the political will to do so. And I think it says a lot about the political power of the banks, right? That they, when they win, when they make a risky bet and they win, they privatize the profits. And when they make a risky bet and they lose, they get to socialize the losses. They become all of our problems. That's because of their political power. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons coming out of this situation.
Yeah, and of course, the average American who is consuming any mainstream corporate news is just getting this very confusing explanation about mismanagement, which I'm sure plays a role. I'm sure there's some mismanagement. I mean, mismanagement is just one way of saying, it's a nice way of saying rigging. I don't know, rigging it for, like you just explained, privatizing profits and then knowing that the U.S. government's going to bail you out if you lose. But then the other thing that I've seen talked about is also a lack of regulation. And that does raise the question of where's the regulation here? Aren't these banks supposed to be overseen by regulators? Shouldn't there be signs that this is coming? It doesn't just happen out of nowhere, does it?
Absolutely. And there were clear signs that this was coming. And, in terms of Silicon Valley Bank in particular, right, that the Federal Reserve actually, reaffirmed how safe they thought Silicon Valley Bank was shortly before its collapse, and testified that it did not present a systemic risk when, in fact, it did. But one of the there's a whole history of deregulation of banking we could point to here. The most significant being the Commodity Futures Modernization Act passed under Bill Clinton, Democratic president, in 2000, which really undid some of the key provisions of the Glass-Steagall reforms, which were put in place to try to, after the Great Depression, to try to prevent something like that from happening again. And so the deregulation of banking has very much been a bipartisan project. Larry Summers was the biggest cheerleader of it at the time. But more recently and significantly to this situation, in 2018, under Trump, bipartisan deregulation of banking happened, which was very important for how it played out here, that when you're thinking about the reserves that a bank has to hold, what counts as a high quality liquid asset? And what this reform changed, or this deregulation in 2018, said that a 30-year treasury bond would now count as a high quality and importantly liquid asset. Now, if you think about it, if I buy a 30-year treasury bond and say, if I hold it for its full term and say in 30 years it's worth $1,000, so in 30 years, it'll be worth $1,000. But, if I'm in a bad situation and I have to sell it, 10 years into that 30 years, I'm not going to be able to get the full $1,000. I'm going to have to accept less money for that, right? But what these banks did, and Silicon Valley Bank and all of these banks that have went under did, is they said, look, under this new system, we're doing just fine because we've got all of these long-term 30-year treasury bonds, which are guaranteed by the US government. So what happened is when rates started to go up, right, when the Federal Reserve started to jack up interest rates, that meant that new bonds which were issued since the interest rates went up had better returns than the old bonds you could get prior to that, right? And so that means that the bonds that these banks were holding were worth less, right? Because why would anyone want to buy one of them from you when they could buy a new bond with a better return? Right. And so the change in the interest rates meant that the collateral that the banks were holding was worth less. And it was this game that when they said, what is this collateral worth? They got to report it as if it was at its full maturity value, right? What their bonds would be worth if they waited the full 30 years to send them, not what they would call mark to market pricing. What are they worth today? Right? What are they worth right now? And so this is what happened when Silicon Valley Bank started to experience a bank run, right? People are worried about the bank and they're starting to move their money out of the bank. Well, they said, okay, well, we need, where are the funds coming to pay people back their money? We got to start selling these 30-year bonds. So then people saw them taking a huge loss on the collateral they were holding. They were selling these, for much less than they stated to the federal government that they testified to the Federal Reserve they were worth. And then when people saw that, they said, oh, wow, there really is a problem. And that just accelerated the bank run, right? And so that's a direct way in which, recent deregulation, greatly contributed to this problem.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an extraordinarily important point. They were not minding the story. I mean, the other kind of subsidiary point about that is the ratings agencies, which were rating SVB. And I remember when Fitch downgraded First Republic to junk, they had been like B+ like the day before. Yeah. And it was just all the same information was available. It's just now people are saying this isn't going to work. So, shades of Arthur Anderson here. Well, Chris Caruso, as always, you got to write a book, man. I'm telling you, I know you've been thinking about it. We need you to enter the field aggressively. But thank you so much for joining us as always here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well,
for those of people who know Chris, you know that this man has a wealth of knowledge about the economy. I really think he's one of our top minds on economic issues. So fantastic. It's terrible situation here with these banks, and we're going to see a few more. And they raised interest rates yesterday, so we'll see, what happens. But there could be some real trouble. But I'll tell you what, they're going to ask you and I to pay for it. That's for sure. But yeah, Larry Summers was mentioned in there. The ghoul of all ghouls, man. That guy is everywhere. He's president of Harvard. Most people don't know this, but when Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed, and, Russia was looking for economic advisors. They got all these people from Harvard, including Jeff Sachs, by the way, who now has kind of switched his whole thing. And they went over here to Russia to advise them, and Larry Summers was playing a big role. He's president of Harvard, playing all these different roles. And subsequently, it came out that they were all, basically insider trading. They were using what their assistance to the Russian economy in order to build up their huge finances. So he was involved in that. He's involved in, helping Wall Street in the Clinton administration. He's the one arguing. He's the most aggressive voice on TV and in the financial press for raising interest rates and causing a recession. He straight up says we need to put millions of people out of work. Famously called by Cornel West the Ariel Sharon of American higher education. One of my favorite phrases of all time. Just truly like someone who you feel like is like a movie script
villain.
Villain of the House of Cards type guy, in terms of politics. But there we are. Well, unfortunately, perhaps for many of you, that will bring us to the end of our show here today on the Freedom Side Live. But thanks to all our guests. Really happy to have been with you. And don't forget, Rania, that...
Oh, I thought I was waiting for you to tell me. I was like, that way.
No, sorry, I was cueing you. You know, sorry.
I was like, whoa, we didn't plan that well at all. Don't forget that you can become a member, a Breakthrough News member, by going to patreon.com/breakthroughnews and becoming a patron. You will get access to exclusive content, including lots of behind a paywall dispatches content, as well as Eugene's monthly seminar on all things related to Africa. And we have some upcoming exclusive content that we'll be announcing relatively soon. And of course, we depend on you guys to keep going, not just to keep going, but to get better and to continue growing, to bring you more. So do that, patreon.com/breakthroughnews, become a patron. And yeah, you can access exclusive content and know that you are playing a very important role in helping keep independent media alive, which we need right now more than ever.
Mm-hmm. Shout out to Gloria Lariva for your donation. Yes. Thank you very much as well. Thanks to everyone for watching, everyone for donating, everyone for joining. We will be back with you next week here on the Freedom Side. So we will see you next time.